Okay, what I want to look at now in learning objective number 2 is the components of internal control. So there are 5 components of internal control. There's the control environment, which basically looks at the environment of the business and the characteristics of that environment. So when we look at that, we can then move to step number 2, which is assessing the risks in this environment. So for a business like a restaurant that accepts cash only and has high cash turnover, obviously there is a risk there that cash can be misappropriated, lost, stolen, etc. So we need to identify the relevant risks within the environment the business is operating. We can then look at control activities. So control activities are all about what we do to mitigate risks, to protect our assets. And we're going to look at 2 different types of control activities in today's workshop that are specifically related to controlling cash. Now, when we have our control activities in place, we also have information and communication that arises from those control activities. So we can look at and analyze how effectively we are managing and controlling assets like cash or mitigating other risks that are relevant in the context that business operates. The last particular component is monitoring. So here we're monitoring what's going on. We're monitoring how effective our control techniques are. We're also monitoring how the business context and business situation may evolve. So that may then influence how we think about what control activities are relevant and whether or not we should modify the nature of those control activities. So let me ask you a question here. Should the Reject Shop at Broadway Shopping Centre employ a security guard? I want you to indicate which answer you think is most appropriate right now. So if I bring up the Reject Shop's web page and we look at some of the items that they have for sale here. So they have dishwashing liquid for $1 each. They have crayons, 12-pack for $5 and so on. These are fairly low value items. So this may have affected your judgment you use when you selected the answer to the question that I just asked you. Now, some of you would have said full time. And if you perceive that there's a high risk that thieves will steal things persistently throughout the store opening hours, then of course the security guard during the full time the store is open, so they are employed full time, would be relevant. So a lot of items may be stolen, which the value of those items may exceed the cost of employing the security guard. So in that case, it makes sense to employ a security guard full time because they are cost effective. Their cost is less than the value of the assets that they are mitigating from being lost. Now, if you perceive that the risk that inventory is stolen is extremely low in this case, then of course you would have indicated no. And if you perceive that there are particular times of the day or times in the week in which the risk of inventory being stolen is higher, then you may have said that it's relevant to employ a security guard part-time to deal with the higher risk of inventory being lost at these times of the day or week. So is there a best answer here? Well, no, it depends, as I said, on your perception of risk. And therefore, that perception of risk is going to drive the types of controls, including employing a security guard, to deal with that risk. Now, when we look at internal control, there are, of course, limitations. Okay, so regardless of how well internal control is designed, it can only provide reasonable assurance that a company is meeting its objectives. Internal controls are limited because of 2 elements. So let's have a look at these 2 elements right now. The first is the human element. And you may have heard that economists don't like people. Well, why is there that statement floating around that economists don't like people? Well, economists have nice models and graphs where they have lines that are straight and curved, etc. And that relates to their expectations as to how people will react to different things in certain ways. So for example, if you put the price up, it's assumed that the demand will go down for a product. which intuitively makes sense. A lot of you have studied economics. A lot of you understand that, if you put the price up, then people are less likely to buy it. And so that's the expectation, that's the model. However, people don't always behave according to expectations and how we would expect them to behave rationally. So let me give you an example. The local council makes decisions about what resources it should devote to protecting public assets in the municipality. Now, before the gyms were shut down due to the coronavirus, I used to park my car a little way from the gym when I went there, away from the main car park, because I like to make sure my car isn't damaged by people opening their door on my car, because the gym car park is relatively tight. And when I went back to my car, I found that there was someone in the park with a pole saw on Sunday afternoon chopping down branches of a tree. So a pole saw looks like this, although the pole saw that the lady was using when I went back to my car was a manual one, so it didn't have a chainsaw head on like this, and she was using that to chop down branches, and she was loading them in the back of her car. And I can only assume she was doing this because she might have had a bird aviary at home, and therefore she wanted some branches off the tree, some real branches, to put in that bird aviary. Now, obviously this is illegal. You can't go to the park and take public assets for your own benefit and chop them down, for example, trees, and take them home in your car. So in that particular case, there was no council worker there that was monitoring this, and so therefore this person was getting away with it. And we would usually assume that people wouldn't do something like this. Based on the average person doesn't go down to the park and take whatever they want and take whatever public assets they feel like taking. So there's the human element there, that people are unpredictable and do things we don't expect. And so therefore internal control is limited because, of course, we don't know every single risk that's going to occur. And there's also consideration too that there's a cost-benefit analysis. We don't want to use excessive resources to protect against things of which there is a low risk of occurring. So for example, there's a low risk that people will chop down tree branches in the park. So therefore you won't find a council ranger wandering around parks on Sunday afternoon making sure people don't do that. But you will find a council ranger wandering around on Sunday afternoon issuing infringement notices for people who have parked their car illegally, because the cost of doing that is relatively low, because the ranger's salary is offset by the infringement notices that are issued. And the benefit of doing that is obviously the council can mitigate people parking illegally. And of course, as I mentioned, they do raise some revenue from that in some instances. So the internal control is limited. We can only go so far, we can only protect assets so far, but we can't protect them perfectly. We can't make sure, for example, that we never ever lose any cash, because of course the cost of doing that will be so excessive that we would lose more through using that particular form of control that is of course designed to protect cash but would end up using up most of the cash.